Welcome to the listening room, a quiet place for long-form thought, calm exploration, and deep understanding. Settle in, and let's begin. There is something quietly strange about how uncomfortable silence has become for us. Not dramatic silence, not the silence of awe or grief or anticipation, but ordinary silence. The silence of a room when nothing is happening. The silence of a morning before a screen is turned on. The silence of a mind with no immediate task to solve. For many people, this kind of stillness feels unnatural, even threatening. We fill it quickly with music, with voices, with scrolling, with background noise. We treat silence not as a neutral state, but as something that must be corrected. This episode is about that instinct. It is about why humans struggle with stillness and silence, not in a poetic or mystical way, but in a deeply human one. Silence confronts us with something we are rarely trained to meet, ourselves, unoccupied and unstructured. When nothing is demanding our attention, we become the thing that demands it. Our thoughts surface, our feelings rise, our awareness becomes sharper. For a nervous system designed to scan for danger and movement, this can feel unsettling. Stillness removes distraction. Silence removes camouflage. Together, they create a mirror, and many of us have never been taught how to stand calmly in front of it. This matters because silence is not rare in life. It exists between moments, between conversations, between decisions, between stages of identity. We encounter it when we wake up, when we try to sleep, when relationships change, when routines collapse, when meaning is uncertain. If silence feels unsafe, then large parts of existence become something we instinctively flee from rather than understand. Throughout history, humans have had a complicated relationship with silence. In some cultures, it has been treated as sacred, in others as suspicious. In some traditions, silence is wisdom, in others, it is weakness. Today, in a world saturated with sound and stimulation, silence often feels like absence, like a void, like nothing. But psychologically, silence is never nothing. It is a space where perception intensifies and where internal life becomes audible. This episode will not romanticize silence, and it will not treat stillness as a moral achievement. We are not here to persuade you that you should love silence. We are here to understand why it feels difficult, why that difficulty is natural, and what it reveals about how the human mind works. When we ask why humans struggle with stillness and silence, we are really asking a deeper question. What happens when the external world stops giving us instructions? What happens when the noise fades and we are left with awareness itself? That question has followed humanity across time. It appears in philosophy, in religion, in psychology, in neuroscience, and in art. And it appears in everyday life when someone says, "I can't just sit and do nothing," or "I need something playing in the background," or "My mind gets too loud when it's quiet." This is not a flaw, it is a clue. Before we go further, let us ground ourselves in the purpose of this episode. This episode will show that humans struggle with stillness and silence not because something is wrong with them, but because the human brain evolved to seek motion, information, and engagement as signs of safety and survival. Stillness and silence remove those signals, and in doing so, they awaken deep layers of awareness, memory, emotion, and identity that modern life rarely gives us space to process. What you will gain is not a technique, not a method, and not a prescription. You will gain perspective. You will gain understanding. You will begin to see your relationship with silence not as a personal weakness, but as a reflection of how perception, biology, culture, and meaning intersect inside you. This will be a calm exploration. We will rely on evidence-based reasoning, historical context, and psychological insight. There will be no pressure to change how you live,
only an invitation to understand why your mind responds the way it does when the world becomes quiet. This thesis will guide everything that follows.
Now we begin Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about the most fundamental reason silence feels uncomfortable. Not cultural, not technological, not philosophical, biological. Before we talk about silence as a mental or emotional experience, we must talk about it as a sensory one. The human nervous system was not designed for stillness in the way we imagine it today. It was designed for movement, change, and detection. For most of human history, silence was rarely neutral. Silence often meant that something had stopped, and when something stops in nature, attention becomes necessary. In early human environments, sound meant life: birds, insects, wind, footsteps, water. Sound indicated activity, safety, continuity. Silence, especially sudden silence, could signal danger. Predators become quiet, prey becomes quiet, the forest becomes quiet when something is wrong. So the brain learned a rule long before language existed: quiet requires attention. This is not anxiety, this is vigilance. It is not pathology, it is protection. When we enter silence today, that ancient rule still operates. The nervous system subtly shifts into a state of alertness, not panic, but readiness. The mind begins to scan internally because the external environment has gone still. If nothing is happening outside, the brain turns inward. This is why silence often feels mentally louder than noise. Noise occupies attention, silence liberates it. And attention, when unoccupied, does not rest, it explores. Your thoughts, memories, worries, images, and unfinished questions are not created by silence, they are revealed by it. Silence removes the cover that distraction provides. Stillness has a similar effect on the body. Movement regulates awareness. When the body moves, sensation distributes outward. When the body becomes still, sensation concentrates inward. Breath becomes noticeable. Tension becomes visible. Restlessness emerges. This is not discomfort in the ordinary sense, it is awareness without direction. Modern life trains us to associate awareness with tasks, with goals, with response. Silence offers awareness without assignment. That can feel unfamiliar, even destabilizing. In evolutionary terms, the mind was shaped to respond, not to simply observe. Silence removes the need to respond, and the nervous system, uncertain what to do with that freedom, generates activity internally. So when someone says, "I can't sit in silence," what they are often experiencing is not fear of silence itself, but the sudden intensity of unstructured awareness. Silence is not empty, it is full of perception. This is why people instinctively reach for sound when quiet appears. A television playing in the background, music while driving, podcasts while walking. These are not merely habits, they are regulators of awareness. They provide the nervous system with gentle motion so that attention does not collapse inward too quickly. This does not make us weak, it makes us human. Stillness and silence remove external scaffolding, and without scaffolding, the mind must support itself. That is a demanding task for a system designed to interact with the environment. This chapter matters because it reframes the struggle. You are not failing at silence. Silence is demanding something your brain was never evolutionarily trained to do continuously. Remain alert without purpose and present without movement. The struggle with silence is not a character flaw, it is a biological inheritance. And once we see that, the question shifts. Instead of asking, "Why am I bad at stillness?" we begin asking, "What does my mind reveal when the world grows quiet?" That is where the real exploration begins.
In the next chapter, we will move beyond biology and into psychology. We will explore how identity, memory, and unresolved emotion become audible in silence, and why stillness often confronts us with parts of ourselves that daily motion allows us to avoid. For now, let this understanding settle gently. Silence is not your enemy. It is a powerful environment, and powerful environments always demand adjustment. This is not something to rush, it is something to understand.
Chapter 2. Silence as a mirror of the inner world. When the external world becomes quiet, something subtle but profound happens. The direction of attention changes. For most of our waking life, attention is outward-facing. It is guided by tasks, responsibilities, conversations, problems to solve, and stimuli to react to. The world gives us instructions, but silence removes those instructions. And when nothing outside is calling for attention, the mind turns inward by default. This is where silence becomes less of a sensory experience and more of a psychological one. Silence is not simply the absence of sound, it is the absence of direction. And when direction disappears, the mind reveals what has been waiting beneath the surface. This is why silence feels different for different people. For one person, it feels peaceful. For another, it feels heavy. For another, it feels restless or emotionally charged. Silence does not impose a specific experience. It amplifies whatever is already present internally. Think of silence as a mirror, not a mirror that judges, but a mirror that reflects. When the surface of the mind is constantly disturbed by activity, it is difficult to see what lies beneath. When that surface stills, what has been accumulating quietly begins to appear. Unfinished thoughts, unresolved emotions, unprocessed memories, questions about identity, fears that have been postponed. These are not created by silence, they are revealed by it. Modern life provides endless ways to avoid this encounter. Distraction is not accidental, it is functional. It allows us to move forward without stopping to integrate every experience emotionally. In many ways, this is adaptive. A world that demanded constant deep reflection would be unbearable. But the consequence is that silence becomes unfamiliar, and unfamiliar psychological environments often feel unsafe even when they are not. When someone says silence makes them anxious, what they often mean is that silence gives space for internal material to surface. The anxiety is not caused by quiet, it is caused by contact. The mind is a storyteller. It is constantly trying to make sense of experience. When it has no external story to follow, it begins telling internal ones. Some of those stories are neutral, some are comforting, some are difficult. Silence removes the competition that normally keeps those narratives in the background. This is why many people prefer background noise. It is not about sound itself, it is about occupying the narrative channel of the brain so that deeper material does not rise too quickly. Silence is psychologically intimate. It places you in direct contact with your own awareness. This intimacy is rarely taught. We are trained to engage, produce, respond, and perform. We are not trained to simply observe what arises within us without needing to fix or label it. So when silence brings forward internal activity, the mind often interprets that activity as a problem. But it is not a problem, it is information. Your restlessness in silence is information about your nervous system. Your discomfort is information about emotional backlog. Your racing thoughts are information about unresolved cognitive loops. Silence does not introduce instability, it exposes structure. This is one reason stillness is often associated with spiritual or philosophical traditions. Not because silence is mystical, but because it reveals, and revelation, when unprepared for, feels intense. Yet, psychologically, this exposure is neutral.
The mind is not punishing you, it is showing you what exists when nothing else is competing for attention. There is another layer to this. Identity itself becomes more noticeable in silence. When we are busy, identity is enacted through action. We know who we are by what we do. But when we are still, identity becomes conceptual. We confront questions that normally remain backgrounded. Who am I when I am not performing a role? Who am I when no one needs anything from me? Who am I when I am not reacting to something external? These are not questions most people consciously ask in silence, but the nervous system feels their presence. Silence removes role-based structure, and without roles, the self becomes less anchored. That unanchoring can feel like unease. The brain prefers predictability. Tasks provide structure. Movement provides orientation. Silence provides neither. It places us in a state of open awareness, and open awareness feels undefined. Undefined states require tolerance, and tolerance is learned, not instinctive. This is why stillness feels harder the less familiar it is, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unpracticed. The mind is encountering itself without intermediaries. This chapter matters because it reframes psychological discomfort in silence as contact with depth, not evidence of dysfunction. The mind is not malfunctioning, it is responding to an environment that removes external organization. Silence asks the psyche to organize itself, and that is demanding. But it is also honest. In silence, there is no performance, no audience, no urgency, only awareness meeting itself. That meeting can feel awkward at first, just as any unfamiliar encounter does, but awkwardness is not threat, it is adjustment. In the next chapter, we will explore how culture and technology have reshaped our tolerance for silence, how modern life has quietly trained us to experience stillness as absence rather than presence, and how constant stimulation has changed the baseline of what feels normal to the human nervous system. For now, simply recognize this: silence is not empty, it is psychologically populated, and what you experience in it is a reflection of what has been waiting to be seen. Chapter 3: How Culture and Technology Changed Our Relationship with Silence. For most of human history, silence was not something we chose, it was something we lived inside. There were no engines, no speakers, no notifications, no constant streams of voices and music. Sound existed, of course, but it was intermittent and meaningful. A voice meant a person was present. A noise meant something had moved. Sound was information, not background. Silence was the natural state between events. Today, silence has become unusual. It is no longer the default environment. It is something we must actively create, and often something we unconsciously avoid. This shift has not happened because humans suddenly became weaker or less reflective. It happened because the structure of daily life changed. Technology has transformed silence from a normal condition into an empty space that can be filled instantly. At any moment, with almost no effort, we can summon sound, images, voices, and stimulation. There is no waiting, no gap, no pause. The nervous system never has to sit in uncertainty. And over time, it learns not to. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly experiences. When stimulation is constant, stillness becomes unfamiliar. When sound is continuous, silence feels abrupt. Not because silence is harmful, but because it is no longer part of the nervous system's baseline expectation. We have trained ourselves to experience silence as interruption instead of environment. Think about how silence appears in modern settings. In elevators, silence feels awkward. In cars, silence feels empty. In homes, silence often means something is missing. We associate quiet with boredom, loneliness, or inactivity. These associations are learned, not inherent. Culturally, productivity has become linked with worth. Motion means value. Activity means purpose. Stillness, by contrast, appears unproductive. And if productivity defines meaning, then stillness begins to feel like absence of meaning. This is not philosophical, it is behavioral conditioning. When the nervous system spends most of its time responding to alerts, messages, media, and tasks, it becomes calibrated to constant input. Silence becomes understimulation, and understimulation feels uncomfortable to a system trained to expect engagement. This is why boredom and silence often merge psychologically. They are not the same, but they feel similar to a brain accustomed to speed. Silence slows the tempo of perception, and tempo change is physiologically noticeable. There is another cultural shift that matters here. In earlier eras, silence often meant privacy. It meant separation from crowds, from labor, from surveillance. Today, silence is no longer required for isolation. One can be alone physically and still socially saturated. Silence has lost its association with solitude and gained association with inactivity. So the mind begins to treat silence not as rest, but as absence of input. And absence feels wrong when input is constant. We also live in a time where information itself has become emotional regulation. We use sound, video, and conversation to stabilize mood. We do not just consume content for knowledge or entertainment, we consume it to shape how we feel. Silence removes that tool. It takes away the emotional steering wheel. Without stimulation, the mind must regulate itself. That is a skill we have not been taught. So when silence appears, the nervous system experiences a kind of withdrawal, not from addiction in the dramatic sense, but from expectation. The expected stream of stimulation stops, and the system notices. This does not mean technology is harmful, it means it is powerful. It reshapes baseline experience. Silence used to be where thinking happened. Now, thinking often happens while noise plays in the background. Silence used to be neutral. Now, it feels like a void. Not because silence changed, but because our environment did. There is also a social dimension. Silence in conversation is often interpreted as discomfort or disconnection. We rush to fill pauses. We fear being perceived as unengaged. We equate silence with awkwardness. Over time, this conditions us to treat silence itself as a social failure. So even when alone, that conditioning remains. Silence feels like something that must be repaired. But silence is not broken. It is simply no longer familiar. This chapter matters because it shows that our discomfort with stillness is not only biological and psychological, it is cultural. We have been trained, slowly and quietly, to experience stimulation as normal and silence as abnormal. And the nervous system always defends what it thinks is normal. When silence appears, it feels like deviation. When deviation appears, attention tightens. When attention tightens, discomfort arises. This is not fear, it is calibration. In earlier chapters, we saw that silence activates ancient vigilance and reveals internal life. Now we see that culture has layered a third factor on top: expectation. We expect noise, we expect motion, we expect engagement. Silence violates that expectation. And the mind always notices when expectation is violated. In the next chapter, we will explore why stillness often feels emotionally heavy, why silence does not only reveal thoughts, but also unresolved feeling, why grief, longing, regret, and memory surface more easily when the world grows quiet. Because silence is not just a mirror of thought, it is a container for emotion. And emotion, when unoccupied, begins to speak.
Chapter 4. Why Silence Awakens Emotion. When sound fades and movement slows, emotion becomes more noticeable. Not because silence creates emotion, but because emotion has space to breathe. In daily life, feeling is often carried along quietly beneath activity. Tasks move us forward, conversation organizes attention, distraction diffuses intensity. Emotion remains present, but it is softened by motion. Silence removes that diffusion. Emotion is a form of energy. It seeks expression, recognition, or integration. When the environment is busy, emotion adapts by becoming quieter. When the environment is still, emotion becomes audible. This is why silence often feels heavier than noise. It concentrates experience. The mind is no longer scattering attention across stimuli. It is allowing experience to gather. Unprocessed emotion does not disappear. It waits. Silence is one of the few environments where it is allowed to surface without competition. Grief often rises in silence. Regret becomes clearer. Longing becomes more defined. Loneliness becomes more visible. Contentment, too, becomes more real. Silence does not privilege negative emotion. It amplifies whatever is present. If peace is present, silence deepens it. If unrest is present, silence reveals it. Modern life rarely gives emotion uninterrupted space. We express emotion in fragments, between responsibilities. Silence creates continuity. It allows feeling to unfold without interruption. That unfolding can feel unfamiliar, especially in a culture that values emotional efficiency. We are taught to manage emotion quickly, to regulate it, to resolve it, to move past it. Silence does not move past. Silence allows. That allowance is often mistaken for danger. The nervous system is sensitive to emotional intensity. When emotion becomes clearer, the body responds. Heart rate changes, breathing shifts, muscles tense or soften. The body notices emotional presence before the mind labels it. This physiological awareness can feel like vulnerability, and vulnerability, when unchosen, feels risky. So the instinct is to reintroduce noise, to restore movement, to return to structure. Not because silence is harmful, but because it invites contact. There is a quiet honesty in silence. It does not distort feeling. It does not rush feeling. It simply holds it. And being held by awareness can feel strange when we are accustomed to doing rather than feeling. This is why silence often becomes associated with sadness or heaviness, not because silence is sad, but because sadness has finally been given room. Emotion needs time. Silence provides time. But time without distraction can feel infinite, and infinite space feels overwhelming to a nervous system trained for containment. In psychological terms, silence removes avoidance mechanisms. Avoidance is not weakness, it is a form of pacing. We avoid what we are not ready to process fully. Silence gently removes that pacing. This is not punishment, it is exposure. And exposure always feels intense at first. Another layer is memory. Emotion is deeply linked to memory. When the mind is quiet, memory becomes more fluid. Past experiences surface not as stories, but as feeling tones. A smell remembered, a moment recalled, a sensation without narrative. Silence allows memory to express itself through emotion rather than language. This can feel sudden, unexpected, disorienting, but it is not random, it is associative. The
The mind is connecting present stillness to past states of stillness. Many emotionally significant moments in life occur in quiet, loss, realization, intimacy, reflection. Silence becomes a doorway to those emotional archives. Stillness activates emotional memory. This is why silence sometimes feels like depth. It is not shallow, it is layered. Thought, identity, memory, and emotion all converge when external input fades. Silence does not simplify experience, it intensifies clarity. And clarity is not always comfortable, but it is always truthful. This chapter matters because it explains why silence can feel emotionally dense. It is not a sign that something is wrong, it is a sign that something is being allowed. When emotion has nowhere to go, it waits. When silence arrives, it is invited. The discomfort people feel in silence is not fear of quiet, it is fear of feeling without distraction. And yet, emotion is not dangerous, it is informative. It tells us what has mattered, what has shaped us, what has not yet settled. Silence becomes a listening space for the emotional body. In the next chapter, we will explore something even deeper. We will explore how stillness and silence confront us with mortality, uncertainty, and the fundamental openness of existence itself. Why quiet moments sometimes feel existential, not emotional. Why the absence of structure make the mind aware of impermanence and fragility. Because silence is not only psychological, it is philosophical. And when the world stops speaking, existence itself becomes audible.
Chapter 5. Silence, Mortality, and the Awareness of Existence. There is a point where silence moves beyond psychology and enters something more fundamental. It is the point where the mind no longer only meets its thoughts or emotions, but meets existence itself. This is where silence can feel vast, unfamiliar, and strangely profound. Not dramatic, not mystical, simply open. In activity, life feels structured. There are tasks, timelines, goals, and momentum. The future pulls us forward, and the past organizes our story. But in stillness, time loosens its grip. The moment becomes wider, and when the moment widens, awareness becomes more spacious. This is often where people feel a subtle unease that is hard to name. It is not sadness, it is not anxiety in the usual sense. It is the awareness that nothing is holding the moment together except presence itself. Silence exposes how much of our sense of stability comes from motion. When we are moving, doing, and planning, life feels continuous. Stillness interrupts that continuity. It shows us that existence is not a stream we control, but something that unfolds regardless of our activity. And that realization can feel unsettling because it reveals how little we ultimately command. In silence, the mind becomes aware of impermanence, not intellectually, but directly. Breath comes and goes. Thought appears and fades. Sound arises and disappears. The body exists moment by moment. Nothing holds still. Even in stillness, everything is changing. This awareness is quiet but powerful. It reminds us that life is not solid, it is process. And when the mind sees process clearly, it naturally brushes against the reality of mortality, not in a fearful way, but in an honest one. Stillness removes the illusion of permanence that activity provides. We are not normally afraid of death in the dramatic sense. We are uneasy with the idea of openness, of not knowing, of not controlling the future. Silence is open space. It does not direct, it does not reassure, it simply exists. And that existence is enough to make us aware of how fragile structure really is. This is why silence sometimes feels too big. It is not emotionally heavy, it is existentially wide.
It removes narrative and replaces it with immediacy, and immediacy has no story. The mind prefers stories. Stories create meaning. Silence removes story. Not permanently, just briefly. But even briefly, that absence can feel like standing at the edge of something vast. This is not a flaw in human psychology. It is a sign of depth. We are creatures who seek coherence. Silence suspends coherence. It does not destroy it, but it pauses it. And in that pause, we glimpse something larger than structure. This is why silence has been associated with philosophy and contemplation across cultures. Not because silence is sacred, but because it is honest. It shows what remains when explanation stops. And what remains is existence itself. This can feel uncomfortable because existence does not come with instructions. There is no checklist, no direction, no objective. There is only awareness. So the mind reaches for activity again, for sound, for structure, for engagement. Not to escape something bad, but to return to something familiar. This chapter matters because it explains why silence can feel serious even when nothing emotional is happening. It is touching something foundational. It is touching the fact that life is temporary, open, and unfolding without guarantees. Silence shows us that we are not standing on solid ground. We are standing in motion, and that realization is quietly humbling. Yet there is something gentle in this as well. When silence removes illusion, it does not take meaning away, it refines it. It shows that meaning is not in control or permanence, it is in presence. Existence does not need noise to be real, it only needs awareness. So when silence feels vast, it is because awareness has expanded, and expansion always feels unfamiliar at first. We are not meant to live continuously in this state. The human mind needs rhythm, movement and stillness, engagement and rest, structure and openness. Silence is one half of that rhythm. In the next and final part, we will gently gather everything we have explored. We will return to the thesis, reflect on each chapter, and allow the understanding to settle without urgency or pressure. Because this episode is not meant to change behavior, it is meant to change relationship. Relationship with silence, relationship with stillness, relationship with awareness itself. And that relationship begins with understanding.
Conclusion. Learning to understand what silence is asking of us. We began this episode by noticing something simple but deeply revealing, that many humans struggle with stillness and silence, not in dramatic ways, but in quiet, everyday ways. We fill the background. We avoid empty space. We feel uneasy when nothing is happening. At first glance, this seems like a small habit, but as we have seen, it is not small at all. It reflects how the human mind, body, and culture have learned to survive, to organize meaning, and to protect stability. This episode has shown that silence is not difficult because we are broken. Silence is difficult because it is powerful. It engages the nervous system. It reveals the inner world. It exposes emotional memory. It interrupts cultural conditioning. It touches the nature of existence itself. And anything that touches all of those layers at once will feel demanding. Our thesis was this: humans struggle with stillness and silence not because something is wrong with them, but because the brain evolved to seek movement, information, and engagement as signs of safety. Silence removes those signals and awakens deeper layers of awareness, memory, emotion, and identity that modern life rarely gives us space to process. Now we can say that more simply. We struggle with silence because silence shows us too much at once.
In Chapter 1, we saw that silence activates ancient biology. The nervous system was built to notice change, motion, and sound. Quiet meant attention, stillness meant readiness. So when silence appears, the body becomes alert, not afraid, not anxious, just awake. That is not malfunction, that is inheritance. In Chapter 2, we saw that silence becomes a mirror of the inner world. When external direction disappears, the mind turns inward. Thoughts, identity, memory, and unresolved experience become more noticeable. Silence does not create this material, it reveals it, and revelation always feels intense before it feels neutral. In Chapter 3, we saw how culture and technology reshaped our expectations. Silence used to be common, now it is rare. We live inside constant stimulation, so silence feels like absence rather than presence. The nervous system has learned to expect engagement. When engagement stops, discomfort arises, not because silence is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. In Chapter 4, we explored emotion. Silence gives emotion space. It removes diffusion. It allows feeling to become clear. Grief, longing, peace, regret, and memory rise, not because silence causes them, but because silence allows them. What feels heavy is often simply what has been waiting. In Chapter 5, we moved into something quieter and deeper. Silence reveals existence without structure. It shows impermanence, openness, and the absence of control. It reminds us that life is unfolding, not fixed. That realization is not frightening, it is humbling, it is honest. Together, these chapters show that silence is not empty. It is layered, it is rich, it is demanding because it is complete. So what changes when we understand this? Not behavior, not habits, not discipline, only relationship. Instead of seeing silence as something to escape, we can begin to see it as something to recognize. Instead of assuming discomfort means danger, we can see it as contact. Instead of labeling restlessness as weakness, we can see it as awareness adjusting to openness. This does not mean we must seek silence. It does not mean we must prefer it. It does not mean we must master it. It only means we no longer misinterpret it. Silence is not asking us to become different. It is asking us to become present to what already exists. Stillness is not a task, it is an environment. And environments do not demand achievement, they only invite awareness. When silence feels uncomfortable, it is not because something is wrong, it is because something is being seen. And being seen is always the beginning of understanding. We are not meant to live in silence constantly. We are rhythmic beings. We need sound and quiet, motion and pause, engagement and rest. Silence is not a replacement for life, it is a dimension of it. The struggle with silence is not something to solve, it is something to understand. And once understood, it softens on its own. Not because silence becomes easy, but because it becomes honest. Because we stop asking silence to be something else and allow it to be what it already is. A space where awareness meets itself, without noise, without urgency, without disguise. That is not emptiness. That is clarity. This has been The Listening Room, a space for clarity, patience, and understanding. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.